Great. Thank you, everyone, and a warm welcome to the session today on investment arbitration in just transition in the Global South. We're very much looking forward to discuss this very important, timely, and very kind of interesting issue that's kind of been underexplored, but despite its importance. And very privileged to co-host this session with Dominic Dakbanja, but also have a great kind of a stellar panelists to get us through the session today. So without much ado, I'll hand over the floor to Dominic just to give us some kind of a quick overview, and then I'll give a quick description of the motivation behind the event before we get started. Over to you, Dominic.
All right. So I would also like to welcome the panelists. Well, as you say, the initiative really started with Kennedy Beaver, who got in touch with me some time ago about organizing a session, and he kept on chasing me with all the pressures around all of us. Let me say, first of all, thank you for the initiative and also getting in touch and getting me involved in this project. You know, the panelists that we have assembled now are people who have seasoned experience in the field of international economic law, have done extensive research on the subject. But I think that the work that we are seeking to look now hasn't been really explored in the literature in the manner that we are seeking to look at, and in particular in the Global South, and the role of international economic treaties in limiting public policy choices and options in the developing world, particularly relating to the subject of just transition. So I'm very pleased to be co-convening this session with Kennedy Beaver, and I would like to express my appreciation to the panelists for generously responding to our call within a very short time. We approached you around a month ago, about 4 weeks ago, and given the pressures around all of us, we weren't really expecting, we were praying actually that you would respond, and indeed you've responded to the call to be part of this session. So let me say thank you so much for generously making yourselves available to speak to the issues that we'll be addressing now. At the end of the presentation, we will see what comes out of the conversation that we'll be having today. So thank you so much, and we look forward to a very fruitful deliberation among us. I will yield back the time to Beaver, Kennedy, for give a bit of context to the conversation. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Dominic, and just kind of to echo those kind of warm remarks, and huge thanks to our panelists, but also to our audience for making the time to attend, and to Blake for giving us the tech support that we need. So just to give you a brief motivation, so by way of introduction, I'm currently a research associate at the Center for the Study of Existential Risk here at University of Cambridge. And at the center, we look at those kinds of risks that are plausible, but we think of them as very remote. And for example, climate change, when we discuss it, we usually talk about 1.5 or 2 degrees. We don't usually talk much about, 3 degrees or 5 degrees as a kind of a reality. So it's kind of usually scenarios, but that may play out, but somewhere kind of down the line or in the future. But today we thought, why not kind of assume that those scenarios not assume actually, but it's true, those scenarios are playing out in some places. We do have some regions where we have 3 degrees of warming already. We do have regions where we have extreme climate impacts through storms, intensified storms, hurricanes, etc., intensified droughts, and such kinds of impacts. And so it's not a hypothetical scenario that climate change is getting worse. It's a real scenario. But also, countries have come together to adopt kind of international instruments to address climate change, most notably the Paris Agreement. And we have the 1.5 or 2 degrees target, and the net zero target, which has now kind of become kind of like the main reference point for global efforts. So if we think about then, we agree that we have these climate targets, climate change is getting worse, then the missing piece of the puzzle is a transition to kind of net zero in a way that we make sure we meet the climate targets. But that kind of sounds like a very simple proposition, but it raises numerous other issues, and which is, what are the dynamics involved in trying to transition to meet net zero climate targets while also meeting other kind of development goals. So this is the motivation behind this panel, where we kind of trying to look at that kind of broad spectrum of climate impact. Some are saying we are now in the context of the existential politics of climate change due to kind of worsening impacts, but also the very difficult politics. Here comes international economic law. What role can it play? And some of the stories that have made the headlines are, for example, if we have to meet net zero, we have to phase out fossil fuels. But phasing out fossil fuels is exposing countries to claims by foreign investors in those sectors. So what does that mean for countries that have to phase out this fossil fuel to meet their climate targets while addressing some of these potential consequences? So we have a great panel today, which kind of will help us to make sense of that kind of a conundrum, but also help us to push our thinking to start taking very seriously some of these scenarios which we think are peripheral, but actually playing out or started to play out. So if anything in this session, we hope we'll move the dial in terms of really provoking the conversation to take seriously the connection between, and here today we'll be focusing on the investment treaty regime and just transition. And we focus on just transition because we want to place emphasis on the necessary efforts needed to meet global climate goals. So I think I'll leave my kind of remarks there. And as we switch to the panel session, just kind of give you an overview. So we'll have a couple of presentations from our panelists, of course, starting with the co-host, Dominic, just to give us a very broad context for those of you who are not familiar with the investment treaty regime, and more specifically arbitration. And then we'll have presentation from our panelists really digging into some of the particular topics and the issues that come up. And then we'll have a block of time for a Q&A session. So if you have any questions, please prepare them as the presentations go along. If you want to pop them in the chat, please do, we'll collect them. Or if you want to ask them in person during the Q&A session, I hope there'll be that opportunity to do so. So without much ado, I'll hand over to Dominic to kickstart the presentations. And then Dominic, you can handle this section for the presentations. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Kennedy, for your brief overview of the session. So I think I'll just go ahead and speak too, instead of sharing the PowerPoint and messing up from here. So I should put myself in proper context to say that so I'm currently, an associate professor of law at the Curtin University Law School, where my subject of teaching now is corporate law. And I recently moved from the University of Western Australia to join Curtin Law School at the beginning of July. And at the center of my research is really around the issues that we are seeking to explore in this session. My research, in particular, specifically, is in the area of international investment treaties. And I seek to theorize around the limitations that the constitutional and public international law duties of states to regulate in the public interest place limitations on the capacity of state to conclude international economic treaties. So, and I research, my focus is largely on Africa. So in today's presentation, I will be speaking generally, looking at the investor-state arbitration, just transition, sustainable development intersections. Looking at the intersection of investment treaty arbitration, just transition, and sustainable development. And it is good in this case to begin from the beginning by looking briefly at the history of international investment law. International investment law, as we know, and because I'm intended to provide a bit of context, I thought that beginning with the history is good. It developed primarily to provide legal protection for foreign investment. There is a colonial context of the development of international investment law. During the colonial period, imperial legal system provided legal protection for foreign investment. And with the gaining of political independence, it became necessary to change the legal regime because especially the colonized developing part of the world, the global south, sought to use domestic law to regulate foreign businesses operating within the various, formerly colonized parts of the world. Now, in parts of the world where colonization didn't exist, such as in Latin America and in other places, there was the use of, diplomacy, the use of war, and so forth. And in particular, the debate between the Latin American, scholars and jurists, policymakers, and the United States about the standards that were to apply in regulating foreign investors or aliens and their property, whereas the United States sought to externalize the norms in terms of an international minimum standard. The Latin American, policymakers and scholars, jurists, argue in favor of national treatment and the domestic law. So international investment law has always been, as Professor Sonaraja pointed out, an area of intense conflict right from the start. And so, as I said, with the signing of the first bilateral investment treaty in 1959 between Pakistan and Germany, and the subsequent gaining of independence by a huge number of African countries in the 60s, investment treaties got concluded. And so they become the basic norm for the protection of, for investment. Today, the primary instruments are international investment treaties. And I've looked at extensively at the World Investment Report 2024. It shows that today there are about 3,291 treaties on trade and investment that regulate the activities of foreign investors. And about 2,000 of them are currently in force. So there is a huge body of international investment treaties that are in place now, which are intended to provide legal protection for foreign investment. And these treaties come with various standards, including the national treatment standard, the most favored nation treatment standard, the fair and equitable treatment standard, full protection and security, the prohibition of performance requirements, provisions on repatriation of investment and returns, the umbrella clause, subrogation clauses, and so forth. So if we look at these terms of investment treaties and the historical context of the development of international investment law, the basic point that we can make is that these treaties developed principally to provide legal protection for foreign investment. And so, and they didn't come with the public interest at the heart, certainly not. So the various standards of investment protection that I have looked at really were presented in very absolute terms, such that the protection of the public interest and the exercise of state powers were not a central feature of investment treaties as they developed historically, even though today there are exceptions that are now being included in investment treaties, intending to ensure that states can exercise their regulatory autonomy. But also, in addition to these substantive standards, there are also provisions dealing with investment dispute settlement, that when disputes arise between the host state and the foreign investor, then the matter become one that must go to international arbitration rather than being resolved between using the domestic dispute settlement mechanisms. So investment treaties then, apart from the substantive standards, also provide for these mechanisms, and that is what we often call investor-state dispute settlement mechanism or investor-state arbitration. And the idea is that, especially if you look at the context of the development of international investment law, that the developing part of the world lacked a robust legal system to resolve disputes between foreign investors. They didn't have expertise. There was going to be local bias. Customary international law didn't prove helpful. diplomatic protection didn't prove helpful. So therefore, there was a need for this regime, which will make room for the protection of foreign investors. So this is the context in which we have international investment treaties as primary instruments for the protection of foreign investment today. So with these standards, foreign investors have now capitalized on these substantive standards, as well as the mechanism for resolving investment dispute to go to international arbitration, bringing various claims against host states. And the question is, how does international investment, how do international investment agreements intersect with just transition and sustainable development? We can look at a number of I've looked at a summary of the World Investment Report, and I can provide you with a context in terms of the intersection of investment treaty, arbitration, just transition, and sustainable development. So if you look at the World Investment Report today, you will find that the total number of investor state claims reach 1,332 and brought against about 132 states. And about 60 new cases were initiated in 2023. 70 of them were brought against developing countries, including least developing countries. And of the 1,332 exit claims, developing countries actually have been the countries that have faced most of the challenges. About 62% of the total number of investment treaty claims have been brought against states. So that means that developing countries are at a higher risk of exposure to investment treaty claims. And these claims obviously have been brought by the global north investors against investors in the developing parts. And if we look at the 2023 claims, most of them related to fossil fuels, related to construction, energy generally. A large number of them centered on this sector. And again, if you look at the reform of investment treaties that were supposed to accommodate the regulatory capacity of states, the suggestion by the World Investment Report is that these reforms really haven't succeeded in limiting the exposure that developing countries have in terms of being sued in international arbitration. And the claims have been brought into against states in various sectors, such as construction, manufacturing, the extractive industry, which accounted for about over half of the claims which were initiated in 2023. So the fossil-related claims or cases had been filed by investors against various developing countries such as Myanmar, Senegal, Mexico, and in fact, a huge number of them came from Latin America, the Caribbean countries. So the point that I'm making here is that these claims are being brought in relation to fossil fuel, the energy sector generally, and they are brought against developing countries. And in terms of the cost of participating in these claims, they are huge. Again, the literature shows that the average treaty claims will amount to about 1.1 billion US dollars. And by the end of the 2023, the World Investment Report shows that a total of 235 fossil fuel-related claims were brought against states. So you can see the heart and intersection of these claims and just transition and sustainable development. So the amount that are being brought, and usually they are, of course, they have to be, I shouldn't say they have to, they are quoted and claimed and made in US dollars. So if you bring that claim against, say, a country such as Ghana, the currency of which is very much, in terms of the exchange rate, not too good in relation to the US dollar, The suggestion is that you got to raise so much so much money locally in order to be able to settle the claim. And I have also looked at the work published by the Colombian Center on Sustainable Development, and it shows the amount of money that needs to be raised by developing countries to be able to deal with issues of sustainability and meet their obligations under the Sustainable Development and Goals. And it suggests estimates around 3.3 to 4.4 trillion per year. And of course, developing countries have fallen short in terms of being able to raise the needed capital or money to meet these obligations. Now, investment treaty claims that come with huge compensation being awarded to foreign investors essentially can wipe out an entire nation's budget so that there will be very limited scope for developing countries to be able to meet their obligations under these treaties. And so if we go back to the Paris Agreement and we look at the obligations of states under Article 2.1c, states are required to strengthen the global response to the threat of climate change in the context of sustainable development, and to make finance flows consistent with a pathway towards low greenhouse gas emissions. Now, to be able to meet this obligation, international treaty obligation, various measures will need to be adopted by states, including phasing out coal-fired, gas-fired power plants, adoption and implementation of energy efficiency standards, adoption and implementation of carbon pricing schemes, revocation of permits for the exploration or extraction of fossil fuel, application of new zoning rules to addressing rising sea levels, and so forth. These are crucial measures to addressing the impact of the extraction of fossil fuels on the environment and climate change generally, which states will legitimately adopt not only under domestic law, but also under international law. But these are some of the measures that are already at the heart of investment treaty claims, so that the adverse impact of these measures on investment will obviously lead to investment treaty claims being brought against states. And there are cases already, such as, for example, ConocoPhillips against Venezuela, which was an oil related claim, energy-related claim brought against Venezuela. And obviously, an amount of over $8 million were awarded against Venezuela, because it sought to exercise sovereignty over its natural resources. So in broad sense, as you can see, these claims are real, and they pose particular challenge to developing countries because of the virus, not only because public interest related measures are at the heart of these claims, but also the public money that has to be spent in trying to defend these claims. Now, in my proposal, I'm concluding very soon, shortly, I am saying that developing countries now need to think about shifting from provisions on corporate social responsibility to provisions on corporate legal responsibility. Provisions on corporate legal responsibility will impose specific duties on foreign investors in terms of their operations in the host states, and those provisions will be legally enforceable against foreign investors. Now, corporate, social responsibility provisions lack, concrete enforcement, reference points, so they really don't serve any useful purpose. But I also propose in my book, The Investment Treaty Regime and Public Interest Regulation in Africa, published in 2022 by Oxford University Press, that developing countries, African countries, need to begin to include what I call the most favored, and this is my proposal, the most favored home third states clause in investment treaties. And these clause will say that those who go, foreign investors ought to operate in accordance with the best environmental, human rights, climate change standards that apply in their home countries. So if you are an investor from the UK and you go to operate in Ghana, for example, you cannot operate at a lesser standard of environmental and human rights obligations than you will do if you were back home, say, in the UK. So I'm proposing that these clauses need to be included in investment treaties so that the foreign investors don't go to our part of the world, the developing world, and operate at lesser standards of environmental and human rights obligations than they do when they operate in their home countries. So I think I will bring this general introduction to a close here and then allow the rest of the panelists to speak. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Dominic, for really giving us a very rich overview. Because we also have, most of the panelists are lawyers, so it's kind of the nitty-gritties of international economic law, but also for the kind of general audience, including myself, who kind of come at the field from a different perspective. So I think now switching gears from a very general introduction that really sets the scene and kind of shows how high the stakes are, we now go into the presentations to really pick out some issues and dig into them in a more concrete way. And Kyla from Queen's University will kind of kick us off in this session on ISDS and the World Bank. So over to you, Kyla.
Thank you so much. I really want to thank Kennedy and Dominic for organizing this session. Also, that was a great setup. I am one of the non-lawyers, so keep that in mind. But yeah, I'm going to talk about the World Bank and its role in obstructing a just transition through its facilitation of investment arbitration. So I'll start by briefly discussing how the World Bank is positioning itself in the discussions and efforts around a just transition. Then I'll introduce you to a key member of the World Bank Group, the International Center for the Settlement of Investment Disputes, or ICSID. Following that, I'll take you through a few case studies that explore different dimensions of a just transition. Begin with distributive justice and a case study of the transition away from coal power. And then I'll move on to procedural and recognitional justice and case study of conflicts over critical or transition minerals. Then I'll make some concluding remarks and recommendations. So the World Bank Group has, for the past few years, been using the language of just transition. The bank is primarily focused on the coal sector, indicating that a just transition requires that the needs of workers and impacted communities be addressed while ensuring improved energy access and affordability in the global south. The bank is positioning itself not just as a source of finance for the phase out of coal, but also of expertise and policy advice. For its part, the International Finance Corporation, which is the private sector lending arm of the World Bank Group, is also deploying the language of just transition in its discussions of critical mineral extraction. So the utilization of these just transition narratives by the bank and the IFC have been labeled by some observers as justice washing, because the advice and conditions that have been attached to the just transition finance have thus far fit the kind of standard Washington consensus playbook of a corporate-friendly and market-led model of energy transition. So my aim is to kind of build on this critique by highlighting how another member of the World Bank Group, the International Center of Settlement for Investment Disputes, or ICSID, is ensuring that the interests of powerful incumbent investors that hail from the global north are given priority in the transition. So for those of you that are not too familiar with the World Bank Group, it's important to recognize that it is made up of 5 distinct institutions: the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, or IBRD, and the International Development Association form what we commonly refer to as the World Bank, that provides financing, policy advice, and technical assistance to governments in developing countries. The 3 other institutions, the IFC, the Multilateral Investment Guarantee Agency, or MIGA, and ICSID, focus on partnering with the private sector. So ICSID was created through a multilateral treaty in 1965. This was a treaty that wasn't really written by states, it was written by World Bank staff. And while it now has broad membership, 158 contracting states as of the end of last year, many countries in the global south, particularly in Latin America, were skeptical and even hostile to the initiative. The World Bank played a key role then in convincing states in the Global South that signing up to ICSID and to investment treaties would help them to create a friendly investment climate, which would in turn lead to increased foreign investment, and then that in turn would lead to or contribute to economic development. The bank had no evidence to support this at the time, and despite many studies trying to find a positive benefit of the system, there continues to be a lack of evidence to this day. The World Bank also pushed states to put clauses into their investment treaties and even their national laws that would allow for disputes to be resolved at ICSID. This has led to it being the most used forum for ISDS. And as it turns out, this was sort of also alluded to by Dominic, the vast majority of cases, this is specifically ICSID cases, 82% have been brought against countries who get funding from the World Bank. It's also interesting to note that 20% of ICSID cases are brought by companies based in the United States. Of course, the US is also the largest shareholder in the World Bank Group and the only one that retains veto power over certain changes in the bank structure. Okay, so let's move on to the first case study so that you get a sense of where I'm going with this. I think that this audience is probably quite familiar with the need to phase out coal-fired power as a major source of emissions. Also a major source of local pollution in many countries, contributes to significant health problems. The World Bank, which previously financed a lot of coal plants, is now very keen to be involved in this phase out and is wrapping everything in the rhetoric of just transition. But it's important to note that a lot of coal plants in some countries in the Global South, like for example, Indonesia and Vietnam, are very young. This isn't the case for all countries, of course. For example, the situation in South Africa is quite different. But I'm generalizing here because in contrast, the Global North really doesn't have much of a problem in terms of this because most coal plants are very old. Why is having young coal plants a problem? Because if you force these plants to retire early, then they are going to lose a lot of value. And when there are foreign investors that are involved, they're going to demand compensation. And if the government doesn't offer enough money, they will go to ISDS to try to get more. So the question is, who is going to pay for this? Indonesia, for example, has got a Just Energy Transition Partnership, or JETP finance. Are they going to use that money to pay off foreign investors? Well, most of that money is in the form of loans. You can't use loans to pay compensation payments. Even if you could, is that really what Indonesia should be spending the money on? Is it just? Should they instead be focusing on ensuring that the communities where these coal plants are better off as a result of the shift? Now, you might rightly ask, how do I know that this is really going to be an issue? What is my evidence? Well, we can just look at what has happened with coal plants coal phase outs in the Global North. Even though we don't really have as many young plants, and we are also much less exposed to ISDS in the Global North, we do have at least 4 cases that had been launched with compensation claims in the hundreds of millions and even billions of dollars, 2 against the Netherlands, 1 against Canada, and 1 against Germany. These countries have plenty of resources to devote to fighting these claims, and yet they still seem to be spooked by this. The Netherlands and Germany are both leaving the Energy Charter Treaty, which is the treaty that was used to bring the claims against them. And Canada has also escaped from future ISDS cases under the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA, the United States. So moving on, because time is short, I'm just going to look at the other side of the transition. So again, I'm sure you're all quite familiar with the fact that as we move to different forms of energy, renewable energy, we are going to need a lot of critical minerals, and a lot of those minerals are located in the Global South. Some governments are making moves to try to capture more of the value of their critical minerals by nationalizing ownership or banning the export of unprocessed minerals, and they are being threatened with ISDS cases as a result. That is important to a just transition, who gets to benefit from the transition, but I want to focus for the moment just on another group, which is local communities who are impacted by mining projects. These communities are dealing with a double injustice. They generally aren't properly consulted about mining projects, they aren't benefiting from them, and if they protest or make their concerns to the government known and are actually eventually listened to and the project is stopped, then what happens? Companies launch ISDS cases, and once again, the communities are completely shut out of the process. Mining disputes make up a quarter of ISDS cases at ICSID, and there are at least 24 that have concerned critical minerals to date. And indeed, the arbitration industry believes that there's going to be a sharp increase in the number of ISDS cases with the energy transition. So to conclude, by facilitating ISDS, ICSID, and thereby the World Bank Group, helps to shift the cost of the energy transition in a manner that places an unfair burden on the Global South, which goes against distributive justice, while also excluding local communities and their rights, which goes against procedural and recognitional justice. So if we are sincere in our desire for a just transition in the Global South, my recommendation is that we should abolish ICSID. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kyla, for kind of concluding with a very clear, concise kind of a recommendation, which is very, very bold. I'm sure there's no doubt as to what you mean by that, that kind of conclusion. Great. So we'll kind of switch gears now to Nicholas, I think, who present to us about a bottom-up approach to aligning international investment agreements and climate change. So Nicholas, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Kennedy. And first, I want to thank you again, Kennedy and Dominic, for having me here. It's a pleasure. It's also a pleasure to follow from Kyla. So the first point I want to make is that most of the discussion on investment treaties, ISDS, and climate change alignment has been focusing on a global north perspective. So this, I mean, as Kyla said, there is a misalignment at the moment. But my first point is that I think most of the discussion has been, approached from a global north perspective. And why do I say this? Well, I say this because if you look at the climate change regime, UN Framework Convention, and the Paris Agreement, there are 5 pillars in that conversation. And in the treaties and in the regime. One is climate mitigation, and we've mainly been talking about that, but there's also climate adaptation, finance for climate action, technology transfer for climate action, and more recently in the Paris Agreement, there is also the question of capacity building. So if you look at the regime, the 5 are crucial to meet the Paris Agreement goals, as you, Kennedy, were saying at the beginning. But much of the discussion on ISDS and climate change is focused on the question of mitigation, which is crucial. I mean, I don't want to get that wrong. And it's mainly then about phasing out fossil fuels and the risk of ISDS litigation, and also the question that the ISDS might be operating as a subsidy for fossil fuels. And this is a problem in relation to Article 2.1c of the Paris Agreement, as Dominic mentioned. But the other 4 aspects that are crucial for Global South countries, that are actually the issues that Global South countries fought for when the UN Framework Convention was being negotiated and the Paris Agreement was being negotiated, are largely, I mean, or maybe not that bad, but mainly ignored. And let me explain why is it that investment treaties and ISDS are connected to these 4 pillars. Climate change adaptation, a main issue for Global South countries, can also trigger ISDS litigation. I mean, countries will need to re-regulate agriculture, water rights, food production. The increase of temperatures around the world and other climate events would put a lot of pressure on these systems. And then here you can also have the risk of regulatory chill, and you can also have the risk that investors ask for compensation. So climate change adaptation is another important issue that is not receiving enough attention. And it's likely, as Dominique and Kyla mentioned, that there's going to be global north investors suing global south countries. So this is one thing. Then the question of funding, of course, is essential for global south countries, which generally lack the financial resources to make the investment to have climate change mitigation and adaptation action. So if you look at the IPCC, we're going to be trillions of US dollars. And it's, as Dominic mentioned, those countries lacking US dollars is mainly countries in the global south. The problem we have here is that investment treaties and ISDS are very bad at attracting foreign investment. So we are providing the global south with a tool to attract foreign investment that actually is ineffective. So we have a regime that shields regulation, we have a regime that creates an obligation to pay compensation, and we also have a regime that does not help global south countries to attract the necessary investment. So here again, a huge problem. Then we have the question of technology transfer, which is key in the UN Framework Convention, is key in the Paris Agreement. And again, investment agreements and ISDS can be, some investment agreements ban technology transfer, some make it more difficult. And again, there are ways in which foreign investors could use ISDS when when global south countries push for technology transfer requirements. So again, another area of misalignment. And the last one is the question of capacity building, which is fundamental. If you look at the way the Paris Agreement is framed, when there is some elements of differentiation there, the question of capacity is crucial. The UN Framework Convention and the Paris Agreement recognize that countries have different capabilities. It recognizes that countries are in different national circumstances. But then again, ISDS tribunals, when they decide cases, they do not recognize these different circumstances. They disregard the different stage of development of the country or the capacity of different countries, for instance, to create revenues in US dollars. So, taking all these points into account, it might not be a surprise to you that I think that all the proposals that are there to align investment treaties ISDS do not take a global south perspective. Why is that? Carve-outs are insufficient because the question for the global south is not only mitigation. There are other issues that are there as well, as I just mentioned. So this is why I think carve-outs are not enough for the global south. What the global south needs is it's a regime that's certain to attract investment that is aligned with the Paris Agreement goals, because there is a need for those investments for mitigation, but also for adaptation. So you would also need carve-outs, not for the sector as such, but for the measures, and not only then for climate mitigation measures, but also for climate adaptation measures. And of course, you would also need a regime that promotes technology transfer as opposed to making it more difficult, and also one that recognizes that countries have different capacities and different national circumstances. So, with the understanding that the best strategy is to start anew and follow from Kyla's proposal to terminate investment agreements, I want to make a sort of second best proposal, recognizing that this might not be very easy, or at least not in the near term. And this is what I call a bottom-up approach to aligning investment treaties and ISDS. And my proposal here is going to be very brief. Maybe we can expand in the Q&A section if somebody would like to hear more about it, is to clearly separate admission from protection. At the moment, what happens is that states are protecting pretty much all the investment they admit in the country, but just when investor is admitted into the country, it gets protection automatically. I want to disentangle these two things and say admission goes on one way, and only the projects that are specifically approved get protection. So that means that global south countries would get to pick and select which projects they want to protect specifically. Yes, and this would mean that, of course, all foreign investment needs to be admitted according to the law. But in addition to that, to get protection, you would need to get this specific approval. So this means only the projects that a country considers are going to contribute to host development, that a country considers aligned with the Paris Agreement, would get this access to ISDS. And the choice would be to the host country. Yeah, and this can be easily aligned, I think, with the Paris Agreement for two reasons. Well, countries will need to have to bear in mind their NDCs when specifically approving projects for ISDS protection. And thanks to the enhanced transparency mechanism of Article 13 of the Paris Agreement, then they could provide lists to the UN system. And then, all countries could check which projects are being protected. Hopefully, this would help some projects that otherwise would not happen to occur, but also would ensure that projects that are not aligned with the Paris Agreement, don't get protection. So, I don't have time to go to the specifics about this mechanism, just to mention that some Southeast nation international investment agreements, particularly Thailand, they have a mechanism of specific approval that could be built on to have this sort of multilateralized, allowing global South countries to specifically choose which projects they want to protect, while the rest would be under the general domestic law system and eventually diplomatic protection under general international law. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Nicholas. And we can see at least we are now meeting part of the objective that we had for this session, which is really pushing the conceptual boundaries of how we think about these topics and how, you know, the investment treaty regime, specifically or more broadly, international economic law connects with climate law as well and policy. And thanks very much for connecting, especially the bottom-up approach. And just to kind of just add a fact to your presentation, Nicholas, is that almost 80%, if I'm not wrong, of NDCs from developing countries are framed within the context of sustainable development. So you see this kind of statement in the preamble that this contribution is framed within the broader context of sustainable development. And I think bringing in this bottom-up approach, but also connecting with the NDCs and the 5 pillars of the climate regime, I think is a very novel conceptual point that really kind of suggests of the need to really expand the conversation, but also, you know, rethink how we kind of conceptualize, you know, the international economic law or international economic regimes and the climate regime as well. Right, so without much ado, last but not least, we have Victoria, who will round off the panel presentations. And Victoria will talk about the risks related to energy investor-state disputes and the impact of stabilization clauses on the energy transition. So here we'll have, again, a kind of an opportunity to look in more fine-grained details at the energy transition and some of the issues that come up, but also some of the proposals. So over to you, Victoria.
Thank you very much for the invite, Dominic and Kenneth, and the entire Energy Earth Governance Institute. So yes, I'm going to address the question of the risks for energy investors, but also most specifically, when we're talking about the Global South, we also have to be aware of those unique provisions that for some reason only appear in the energy and mining contracts that are in the Global South. And one of those provisions is the stabilization clause. So the mere fact that you will only find a stabilization clause in contracts, energy and mining contracts signed in the Global South, that's the start of you to question, like, is it really a fair clause? If it was a fair clause, why don't we find it in the UK? Why don't we find it in France? Why don't we find it in all these other big countries? So the starting point before we even go to the risks is to understand that these clauses, stabilization clauses, in most cases only appear in oil, gas, energy, and mining agreements that are signed in the Global South. And to start with, a stabilization clause, these are basically provisions that are inserted in contracts to protect the investor from any political instabilities. What they do is to ensure that in case of a change in a legal regime or even a political regime, the investors' investments are protected. There are different types of stabilization clauses. You'd have like a freezing clause that will ensure that the country cannot make any laws that will have a negative impact on the investments in the country. You'll have like legal clauses. So basically there are different types of stabilization clauses, but the main focus here is what is their impact, especially on the global move to transition to a low carbon economy. So before I even move further, we can start by appreciating the fact that the energy transition is real. It's happening in different countries. It's already happening. But however, this transition, although most people are talking about the energy justice, the just transition, if you look closely, the aspect of justice is missing. And why is it missing? First, you realize that the most countries that have already utilized their energy resources, the fossil fuels, are the ones that are mostly pushing for the energy transition. And then for the developing countries in the global south, although they're also embracing the transition, there are those unique energy challenges that they experience. For instance, issues of energy poverty. I've written extensively of energy poverty, energy access. Up to now, you find that there are so many people who lack access to modern energy, like electricity. This is the 21st century. People are dying in hospitals because hospitals don't have access to electricity. The schools, how can they use laptops if they don't have access to electricity? So those are the unique energy challenges. And for the energy transition to be fair and just, you have to first ensure that there is a level playing field. Before countries are forced to leave fossil fuels in the ground, ask yourself a question: are the renewables capable of taking these countries through industrialization, urbanization, and to address all the economic challenges? So that is the first step, starting point for the energy transition. To say that whereas we're advocating for an energy justice, a just transition, in most cases, these are theoretical aspects that people are pushing forward to force countries to say, oh, there is a just transition, there's energy justice. What exactly is justice to you? So in that regard, I'll also just ensure that I pass this through. Myself, I came up with the concept of the energy progression, which is to the effect that no country should be left behind. Countries that are poor that still need these energy resources, let them progress from one energy use to another. And in the process of progressing, what I consider to be justice for me is to ensure that they have the necessary technology, they have the necessary finances to utilize all their energy resources. And countries that have already benefited from these resources, it would just be just for them to leave the fossil fuels in the ground. So having talked about the energy justice and the theories, or what I disagree with the concept, now I'll move on to the aspect of the risks associated with the energy transition, especially for energy investors. Obviously, with the energy transition, I categorize these risks. I think I'll share my book with the organizers afterwards. I categorize the risks into three. You have the financial risks, you have the social risks, you have the legal risks. And under the legal risks, that's where I bring in the aspect of the stabilization clause. But I'll first go to the financial risk. The financial risk has been evidenced in different countries. First and foremost, we have to agree that energy investments are very expensive ventures. Energy and mining investments, they are very expensive ventures requiring large amounts of capital, which is beyond the reach of any government, implying that for host governments in the global south to be able to develop their energy resources, they have to rely on international energy investors. International energy investors also have to rely on supporting organizations or even financial institutions like the World Bank. But in recent years, we have seen these financial institutions, the World Bank, even the EU passed a resolution whereby they are so keen not to finance fossil fuel projects. That's a financial risk for the investor. It's also a financial risk for the host state. And that risk is being caused by the energy transition, because right now we are in the global move to transition to a low carbon economy. So any project that is not aligning with the energy transition is considered to be risky. Then we go to the social risks. Because of the constraint in the finances, we're seeing that a large number of people, there is an escalation when it comes to the people who are lacking access to modern energy. Because remember, like I mentioned, because of this lack of justice in the global south, we already have over 600 million people who lack access to electricity, modern energy. Now with the constraints on finances to develop energy infrastructure projects, that number is going to escalate. Why? Because the population growth is estimated to increase. So if right now we have 1.3 billion people who lack access to modern energy globally, and yet the population is going to increase, what exactly will happen? The number of people without access to modern energy will increase. And yet here we are talking about the just energy transition. Then obviously that is going to create the social risks. The social risk, the number of people who lack access to modern energy, and then the increase in bills, energy bills, because even when we are talking about energy poverty, most people think it is a problem for the global south, but even in the global north, right here, I'm in the UK, you find that people struggle to pay their bills. So if certain energy resources are left behind and we're like, we are only going to focus on renewables, the energy bills will increase. So those are the social risks. And then the legal risks, obviously, that are relevant for this session because of the arbitration and investment treaties is due to the fact that right now, you might think that because of the energy transition, you would have to let go of some of the provisions that would make it hard for countries to transition to a low carbon economy. But in the project we did for the EITI, that is the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, we did a project through my company. We reviewed contracts, fossil fuel contracts that were signed before the 2015 Paris Agreement, especially in the global south. And most of them had stabilization clauses. The wording was the same. Then we were like, okay, since now we are moving towards a low carbon economy, let's review the contracts that were signed after 2015, that is after the 2015 Paris Agreement, and see if the wording of the stabilization clauses has changed, or if countries have actually gotten rid of these clauses. To our surprise, the clauses are still there. The wording is still the same. What is the impact of these clauses to the move to transition to a low carbon economy? It implies that if a country has already committed itself, because remember, we have to start with the basics. Energy projects are for a very long period of time, often lasting for 20 or 30 years. So if a country has committed that they will develop the oil and gas resources for 30 years, and then a country comes up with provisions or even laws that is likely to have a negative impact on the development of the oil and gas, that means that there will be disputes, and these disputes will end up in international arbitration. And unfortunately, the investment treaties, including the BITs and the multilateral investment treaties, including the exit, they do not take into consideration these challenges from the contract negotiations and contract signature. The tribunal, the members of the tribunal are just so keen, like Nicholas was saying, they're just so keen to ensure that they apply the same rules to same countries without really taking into consideration these unique challenges. That's why right now we are seeing a rise in different countries, a rise of energy disputes and mining disputes in different countries. And most of these disputes are focused on the breach of stabilization clauses. So in conclusion, I'll note that the starting point for us even to understand the impact of the investment treaties or even the risks associated with the energy sector is to look at the clauses in these agreements that countries sign. Are these clauses in alignment with the energy transition? And in most cases, the answer to that is in the negative, they're not. And if a country fails to abide with the clauses, including the stabilization clauses that they have committed themselves to in these contracts, there will always be disputes that end up international arbitration, and these disputes are never decided in the favor of the host government. So in a way, the risks associated with the energy transition impacts both the investor and the host state. But when it comes to investment disputes and arbitration disputes, you'll find that it's mostly the host government that will investors or the foreign companies. So that will be it for me. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much, Victoria, for kind of rounding off the presentations very nicely by focusing on the energy piece of the puzzle, which is very critical because if we are to transition not only to kind of meet the mitigation targets, as has been mentioned, but also other social goals, it's very important to think about risk, but also in that disaggregated manner with the financial risk, the social risk, and the legal risk. So given those very rich presentations, so I'll hand over the floor, I'll yield the floor to my colleague Dominic to take us through the Q&A session. And just to note logistically, so if you'd like to ask a question, please use the Q&A function. You can write your question there. If you'd like to kind of ask your question live or read it out, our colleague Blake can make you a panelist. So we'll kind of give you that option. If you prefer not, then just kind of read your question and we'll try to answer it. So I'll hand over to Dominic to take us through the Q&A session. And let me know, Dominic, if you need me to read some of the questions.
Yes, so let me say thank you to the panelists once again. I think though we haven't concluded yet, the presentations really support the point that we were right in organizing these the section specifically addressing the issue of investment treaty arbitration and just transition. So we will afford people opportunity to raise questions. But maybe since I'm one of the co-conveners and chair, I might take the liberty to ask or to ask questions to make some further comments. So I think both Victoria and Nicholas essentially made the point that arbitral tribunal do not treat, say, the global south countries, the global north countries differently. But the problem might be that investment treaties, stabilization clauses do not make any exception for, this is not to excuse investment treaty tribunals, actually. I have my own very strong views on that subject. But the point is, investment treaty provisions, stabilization clauses do not make any exception, I guess, for the tribunal to do otherwise in relation to the developing country. So perhaps there's a structural, a textual problem there, which probably needs to be addressed. And so maybe Victoria and Nicholas will want to respond to that. Carla's proposal sits very well with me, and I'm sure Nicholas also supported that view about essentially abolishing the exit. And that is, well, I would recommend, with all humility, if you look at the last chapter of my book, that is the point that I am making, that and more seriously, that if we look at the role of national constitution, the role of domestic courts and the national constitutions, and even in international investment law in relation to the protection of the environment and human rights generally, and the jurisdiction of national courts over all individuals, including foreign investors. And if you look at the specific text of the country that you may have chosen, you may well find that there is constitutional limit to the capacity of states to conclude these agreements, assigning jurisdiction that should be exercised by domestic courts to investment treaty arbitration. So I have argued against investment treaty arbitration on the basis of analyzing the constitutions of various African countries. And so I'm happy to hear that I'm not the only person taking a rather uncommon, radical view about abolishing investment treaty arbitration and think about going back to the domestic courts. The failures of investment treaty arbitration on questions of transparency, neutrality, predictability in terms of the decision that come out essentially point to the fact that the system itself is not as efficient as it was designed and has been reformed to work. So we need to rethink alternative dispute resolution mechanisms. So perhaps you may want to further elaborate on what will be the alternatives to investment treaty arbitration. And in my case, I said, let's go back to the domestic court, but it will be good to hear from your views on this matter. So I don't know whether I should allow you to respond, and then we can now pick questions from members of the floor, and we can read through the questions that have come in. Probably I should let you respond if there are any comments from Victoria on the lack of exceptions in stabilization clauses and investment treaties for arbitral tribunals to do otherwise in relation to the global south, and the question of what will be the alternative to investment treaty arbitration if we are asking for an abolition of the regime.
Thank you very much for that. First and foremost, when it comes to stabilization clauses, I've always argued that they need to be abolished because there are already other alternatives. There are already other ways to protect investments without you necessarily having a stabilization clause in your contract. Because with stabilization clauses, they're protecting investments. Most of these countries, they already have investment legislations. They have investment laws. They are all also party to various bilateral investment treaties that protect investors. They are party to various multilateral treaties that protect investors. So obviously, there is an alternative to stabilization clauses. And also the other thing that countries use to worry about, especially in the global south, is the political instability, saying that, oh, in case of a change of regime, then their investments will be at risk. Still, whether a country has a stabilization clause or not, there can always be political instability, but there are already other alternatives to protect these investments. So for stabilization clause, I believe that they don't have a place in the 21st century. They're just clauses that were used to manipulate host governments. And right now, they do not really need to sign these clauses. That's one. And then when it comes to the multilateral investment treaties, we have seen countries, the investment treaties, we have seen countries like South Africa that really abolished most of the BITs that they had signed because they realized that these BITs were not for their own benefit. They were not for the benefit of the host government. So they had to be abolished. We have seen when it comes to the multilateral investment treaties, we have seen various attacks on the Energy Charter Treaty. And these attacks, obviously, the people who are attacking the Energy Charter Treaty will be like, oh, because it's not in alignment with the energy transition or climate change. But obviously, it's because most of these countries in the global north were found to be liable under that treaty. So because of the losses they were making, because of the cases that were being decided in favor of the host of the investor, they realized that, oh, now we feel the Energy Charter Treaty is not a good treaty. It's the same thing with the global south. Most of these in multilateral investment treaties like ICSID, they were never made to protect the interests of the global south. So if countries in the global south, countries in the global north can attack their own unique treaty on energy, that is the Energy Charter Treaty, because it no longer works for you, why should the global south now keep on the same old regime that is still not working for them? Let them abolish it. Introduce investment regimes that will take into consideration the unique challenges that are being experienced in the global south. Like it's time to start afresh and have control over the things that you think are relevant for you. Because the mistake we make is to think that we have a level playing field when it comes to investments or even development or even the benefiting from the energy sector. That level playing field is not there. So it would be unjust for you to stick to a regime that hasn't worked for you in the past, that doesn't recognize your unique challenges, that will treat you the same way as another country that already is at a different level. Let them abolish them and come up with unique investment treaties that would work for the global south. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, I'll allow the panelists, in case they have further comments to what Victoria has said.
Yeah, I guess we can do the reversal and then I can just chip in. Yeah. So thanks for the questions as well. There are a couple of questions from Wadis in the chat. So thanks for that as well. So I'll try to answer your point, Dominic, and then make a very general comment on the future and what can we do. On your specific point, Dominic, I think there is enough textual base in investment treaties to do a lot of things that haven't been done. For instance, if you look at what is fair and equitable, well, I guess what's fair and equitable will need to include what you can expect from investing in a country that is different from another country. And in fact, there are one or two investment awards that when they discuss the question of legitimate expectations, this floated the point of what is, what can you expect when you invest in a country there is transitioning from A to B, or there is in a particular situation and there is under a civil war. So it's not, I don't think it's impossible based on the text as such. I think there are other considerations that would take us long to go through here, but just to mention one, I think investment treaties, the way they are interpreted, is not just coincidence, and it's part of the people who wanted this regime in the first place in the 1950s, and what were their intentions and their aspirations. And you know how much they wanted to tackle the problem, but was for them a problem. I mean, decolonization, well, for them was a problem. The chances of transitioning from A to B, here we are also talking about a transition, and so there are some similarities there. So that's just to your point. And then more generally, I think Waris is making the question. I mean, I'm just going to focus on question 2 on why Global South countries are signing these treaties. And I think, of course, it's tempting to say that there is an imposition from the Global North to the Global South. It's tempting to say that, you know, why, as it's like, it sounds like irrational. But I mean, I want to try to understand this from a different perspective as I'm getting older. And one of the things is that you see that most investment negotiators and people in governments are really concerned about attracting investment. And I think part of the problem is that many countries around the world depend on foreign private investment for, let's say, you know, trying to address the Sustainable Development Goals. And this goes back to a point that Kyla made at the beginning about what's the model of development. So I think there is a relationship between these two things. So that this sort of dependency on foreign private investment, I think, is kind of related to investment treaties, and many countries are afraid of, you know, terminating these treaties being regarded or interpreted as a very bad signal to attract investment. So I think that's a genuine problem, and that's why many Global South countries are worried or are not feeling comfortable about having a more bold approach to terminating investment agreements. And I'm sure there are other reasons too, but just I wanted to mention that one, and in a way answer to Waris' question.
Okay, I don't know whether Kyla has any comment, and then
Yeah, sure, I can jump in. First of all, I'm definitely going to pick up your book because it sounds like be really helpful for me to read that, especially that final chapter. But I agree with you that I think it should return to domestic courts. Also, just want to echo what Victoria said about you know, having a clean slate. These clauses, these treaties are just not fit for purpose. I know that suggesting that we abolish ICSID seems radical, but I don't see it actually as a panacea, because of course there are other arbitration forums that can be used, like UNCITRAL and so forth. So we have to abolish ICSID alongside terminating treaties, and that's a lot. But it is actually, I do think that it's fairly easy for governments to withdraw from ICSID, aside from the political issues. You know, countries have withdrawn. There are countries that were never involved with it in the first place. And I do think it would send sort of a message if countries in the Global South kind of en masse suggested, hey, World Bank, you're supposed to be actually helping us with this transition. How does it make any sense whatsoever that you know, on one side of the World Bank, you're saying you want to do all these things, and on the other side, you know, you're making it much more difficult for us to do so. So I think that inconsistency within that, you know, doesn't necessarily exist with other like UNCITRAL and so forth. I think we can exploit that inconsistency. So that's, I guess, also to Waris's first question, you know, is it possible to reform BITS in their current form considering the challenges? I don't think so. I think that the sort of tweaks that we've had to bilateral investment treaties to try to tighten up the language is not sufficient. I think we do need to start from sort of a clean slate. I also just want to, if I can, I want to ask Nicholas a question, because I was interested in his proposal that government should sort of approve which projects can be protected by ISDS. And because, Nicholas, your work on sort of community level impacts and projects and so forth has been very influential on me. I'm curious as to how you see that it could be potentially problematic because often the government doesn't initially have any problem with the investment. They're happy for the mining project to come in. They see it as potential revenue and so forth. And it's only after an indigenous community, a local community kind of pushes back because they're not getting benefits, because they're seeing really negative impacts, that then eventually it turns into an ISDS case. Do you see a potential risk of leaving it to the government to decide what to approve, that we'll still end up with disputes that are completely inappropriate?
Yeah, that's a great question, Kyla, and I'm not sure I have like a perfect answer, and I say that because I mean, as you note, governments often do not the right thing. But my general point there would be how we create incentives for governments to do the right thing. And my intuition is that if you had a system in which you need specific approval, that process of specific approval can also be to some extent more political as opposed to just technocratic, and in that way you could involve communities. I mean, my vision is that only very few projects would get that kind of support, and there will be projects that in a way governments could ask in exchange for ISDS protection, which could also be reimagined, of course, that they could ask some kind of more alignment with the SDGs, for instance. And that could be part of the deal, how you get that protection. So, I mean, you would open up a space, I guess, to reconsider what kind of projects get protection. That's why I'm very interested in trying to kind of link the climate change regime with investment protection, because I mean, you even have the IPCC saying on the one hand, more investment is necessary, and then investment agreements do not work. But I mean, it's got to be private investment. They even say that, you know, I mean, and for global South countries, attracting foreign private investment, it comes with certain attachments. And I mean, I find it very difficult that you get rid of all of them altogether. You know, you're always going to create the right quote unquote climate for that thing, you know. So my sense is whether you kind of, you know, use the opportunity, for instance, to say that investment that get ISDS protection needs to be aligned with the SDGs and the climate agreement system. And with the climate regime, and now that you have the enhanced transparency mechanism that is going to be operational, you know, and it's going to be the first biannual submission, is that projects that get ISDS support would need to be listed there. And if you do that, that means that it will be public and we all know which projects are being protected and the rest are not protected at all. I think that will be quite an important move. Of course, if governments want to protect whatever, then there's very little you can do, but at least we will know these projects are being protected, and they will create a sort of space for communities to voice their concerns much earlier. They don't need to get to the point where, you know, the investor is mismanaging the project, or you see the environmental consequences. You could act earlier. So it's not perfect, but I think it could move us closer to something that is aligned with the Paris Agreement.
Now, if I may make a contribution on the question of your proposal around relating to the question that Kyla just mentioned. So I think there are provisions in investment treaty that allow the state to admit subject to domestic law. Some don't have those provisions. So now, if you just admit, so strategically, the only way you probably can treat a project differently and not get sued by the foreign investor is where at the point of admission, you are clear about the project and the differential treatment that may arise. If you simply admit a foreign investor and they are at liberty to undertake any project at all, then it will become difficult for you to now seek to treat the investment project differently. If you treat the investment project differently, there may be a claim of maybe national treatment or some other claim in relation to the most favored nation treatment standard or even any of those terms, expropriation, or any of those terms could be a basis on which the foreign investors could challenge the foreign investors. So perhaps if the other new provisions are included in investment treaties, to allow that, or that at the point of the admission subject to domestic law, you'll be clear, the project admission process will be clear about the sort of project and the sort of treatment that it can receive. Otherwise, then you will open another level of litigation altogether. Let me see whether there are
if I may,
questions.
Dominic, sorry, very briefly to that. Yes, I agree. You need a specific provision. But the thing is that some countries in Southeast Asia had those provisions in the past. And for reasons that I'm trying to understand, they decided not to use them anymore. One of the reasons is that because investment tribunals kind of mistreated the provisions, saying that they were meaningless. But I mean, at the ASEAN level, there are also some provisions that could be used along those lines. So my point would be, instead of using a carve-out, that will, again, you will need to add that to investment treaties because there's no cover at the moment. I think it makes more sense to follow the same approach as it was followed with the Paris Agreement. That is a bottom-up approach. Countries have their NDCs, and you expect them that they have an investment policy that is aligned to their NDCs. And for that reason, that investment policy needs to be kind of feed into the climate regime, and needs to be transparent as the NDCs are transparent, and they need to be published and all that. But yeah, as I said, I mean, the proposal have different elements that are difficult to explain in a couple of minutes. But thanks for your question.
Thank you. There's a question there. How do you see the Brazilian Cooperation Facilitation Investment Agreement and the EU-Angola Cooperation Agreement Facilitation Agreement against bids? Do you advise countries in the Global South to sign such agreement instead of bids? I mean, I could potentially be responding to this, but I haven't looked at these agreements, and I don't know their content and the extent to which they provide a useful reference point. But I don't know whether there's any member of the panel who has seen this agreement. Perhaps if the person who asked the question worries, had maybe been clear as to relevant aspect of those agreements that relate to the question, we could better respond to that. But I haven't looked at these agreements, so I don't know whether any member of the panel has any knowledge about these agreements. Otherwise, then the questioner could maybe get clearer about which aspects specifically are worth considering, so that we could specifically respond to that.
I haven't looked at these specific agreements. I would just say generally that Brazil does not have ISDS in its agreements, and I think that is a good approach. They're often held up as an example of a country that attracts a lot of foreign investment without having to offer ISDS, and so I think that generally is a good approach. But I don't know anything about those specific agreements.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not an expert either, but the only thing I can perhaps add to that is that if you look at UNCTAD's figures, there are more and more investment agreements with facilitation provisions, and there are also more investment agreements with facilitation provisions and without ISDS. And I want to underline the without ISDS. An agreement that I find quite interesting, and I don't know much about, is the Australia-Singapore green trade and investment agreement. It's not the right name of it, but it has a lot of facilitation provisions for trade and investment on green goods and green investment, on quote unquote green there. And which is very interesting there is that you separate the question of protection from attraction and facilitation, as it seems to be that protection is not really promoting or attracting investment. I think that's probably a good approach for Global South countries to take seriously what really serves to attract and facilitate investment and what really does not. So in that regard, maybe, yes, where is his writing pointing us in that direction? And I think UNCTAD is doing some work on, more the facilitation aspect.
Thank you. I think these are the questions that I see in the question and answer section. If I may make a brief comment on the question around the reform, already there are ongoing efforts to reform investment treaties, and various clauses have been included to limit or to preserve the authority of states to regulate. And I was just looking at, I think I made that point earlier when I was when I was speaking. And the World Investment Report says that the reform, that is the 2024 World Investment Report, says that the reform of international investment agreements to preserve the public interest regulatory authority of states has failed to mitigate the risk of investor state claims being brought against for states. I haven't seen a detailed analysis of why the World Investment Report came to this conclusion, but I've done my own work around that, and I've published in African Journal of International Economic Law and the Journal of World Investment and Report, where I look at these reforms and their efficacy. And the basic point that I make there is that these the clauses that are now being included supposedly to preserve states' authority to regulate come with qualifications that essentially take away the potency of those supposed exemptions. And so, reform efforts have been made already, and there are ongoing reform. But if you look at those, and most of the suggestions, for example, around corporate social responsibility, provisions that are now being included in investment treaty dealing with the subject of corporate social responsibility, these are soft, law provisions that don't come with any obligations that states can take against foreign investors. So yes, reforms are ongoing, reforms have been made, but it is unlikely that they come with the efficacy that will really assure states of the the space to regulate in the public interest. So if there are no further questions, well, let me see what leave space to see whether there are any further questions.
I think we ran out of time, so we could just wrap up them.
Okay. All right. So so let me say thank you so much to the panelists for your very generous time and ideas and contribution to this conversation. I think we feel justified in calling this session in light of the rich, contribution that you have made. And so we thank you so much. We, going forward into the future, we haven't made concrete commitments yet, but we are thinking about the possibility of maybe developing a concept note for a special issue. And I'm just thinking now, which I didn't mention to my co-convener, the possibility of maybe, if not a special issue, but a book that we could edit and have conclusions from the contributors and maybe look up to other potential contributions to the project. So we will explore that, and we will get in touch with you about that. And if we are not able to do so, we'll certainly let you know. But let me say that thank you so much for making yourself available, responding to our invitation within a very short time. We are grateful. I don't know whether there is any further comment that Kennedy would like to make before we bring proceedings to a close. Of course, let me say thanks so much to the other participants behind the scene who we cannot see. We are grateful as well for joining us and contributing to the session by way of the question that you have raised.
Great, thank you very much, Dominic. And I think I'll just conclude with a few words and kind of just mention the main takeaway for me, at least in this session, is we need to push the conceptual boundaries in how we think about this issue. And there's not a lack of ideas on how to do so. And so this is a conversation starter. And as Dominic has mentioned, we'll be exploring ways of moving it forward. So a huge thank you to everyone. And I think we can now bring the proceedings to a close. Thank you, everyone. And thanks to the ESG team that has helped us to set up these sessions.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.